Welcome to the first episode of our movie podcast, where we analyze the political context as well as the economic context of various films that have impacted the world in various ways. I'm joined by my colleagues, Nolan.
Nolan Huang, nice to meet you guys.
Jackson Canales, thank you.
Tommy Lottie.
And we're very excited for you guys to be joining us today. I think, with the start of our movies here,
We're starting in a influential decade.
for sure, the 1930s with the Wizard of Oz.
And I think the Wizard of Oz holds a lot of interesting significance in the history of film. It's the first Technicolor film in history, and I think the power that it brought using the power of color in film, something that people had really never seen before until this movie, and the way that they did it, I think it changed cinema forever.
100%.
And it really holds a deep impact, and you can see that impact to this day in cinema that the Wizard of Oz was able to do.
For sure. I mean, even watching it almost 100 years later, when Dorothy walks out and you see all that color, it hits you, I mean, It makes you like...
It's an unworldly experience.
You have to think what the audience thought in the 1930s when they're watching this film and they've never seen color in this way before. And Dorothy walks through that door, and it's a whole new world.
I really wonder, was that part of the marketing? Did people know that they were walking in on that? Or was that a kind of just a experience
surprise,
you get?
yeah.
Because if it was a surprise, I mean, I can't even imagine being...
It's a technological revolution, in fact, I think,
sure.
in this film. It's not just a cinematography that's different than anything you've seen before, but something that's just completely unseen and it's completely unheard of.
And I think the power of the Wizard of Oz is what it does is it blends. You have hundreds, even thousands of years of storytelling of these mythical tales of other worlds and characters that are fantastical and otherworldly. And it takes these old stories. Wizard of Oz at this point was 40, 50 years old, this story. And they translate it to this new, modern, this foreign ground of cinema that they were able to take this old story and translate it to. And I think it shows the power, and it really showed the people the potential of what cinema could be at the time. And I think that alone makes it an incredibly significant movie.
So what do you think the Wizard of Oz tells us about the context historically of the time that we're looking at here in the 1930s?
Yeah, so you have cinema, which at that point was about 30 years old. You had a lot of black and white, some stills movies, a lot of short films that people would call the talkies, at the time.
Yeah.
And they were a very new thing. And you have this studio, MGM, which at the time was, incredibly powerful, the biggest studio in the 30s. And they're really just flexing their muscles with this movie, and they're showing what they could do, and also opening a door to the future. And I think that shows what the 30s were, emerging from the 1920s, which was, the roaring 20s, and you have the Great Depression, and you have this really this economic downturn and going into the war. And this Wizard of Oz just kind of gives people a glimpse of hope at what the future could be and at what things could be when they get better. And I think that really...
It was a wake up call, to not just other film studios on what film could look like and what it can feel like, but just society in general. It's not all black and white, it's not all the Great Depression. We're moving forward, we're moving to a brighter time, and I think that's important. You look at it wasn't a day-to-day switch, It wasn't the Wizard of Oz comes out and everyone's doing Technicolor now, I mean, there were still plenty of black and white films, but it was kind of a shift to what things can look like if we push forward, which
Sure.
I think is great,
Sure. Let's even divulge more further into this discourse of the paradigm between the black and white and even this drawn out color at the start of the Wizard of Oz compared to the high definition color that we see in the world, in the fantasy world, towards the end of the movie. So what does that say perhaps about the time that we're looking at? I think maybe that we were in a depressive state in American history and we're moving into the future. Perhaps it's symbolic of the historical period of the time.
That's good.
100%. And I think that, you know, really what got America and the world in general out of the Great Depression was World War II. And this Wizard of Oz, it came out in the back end of the 30s, going into the World War II. You have the rise of fascism in Europe and expansionist policy. And I think that this impending doom, it feels like, with World War II, kind of Dorothy, again, walking through that door into this fantastical world kind of shows that, yeah, it's black and white. We have to go through this quote-unquote tornado of World War II, similar to what happens in the movie. You come out on the other side, and you're just in this magical world of the future and what can possibly happen, and the beautiful color that we have on the other side that you see after World War II with the baby boom, and the suburbanization of the world, and this massive growth of wealth and prosperity in America. And I really think that Wizard of Oz encapsulates this transcendent period in American history.
Yeah, and I think the idea of having the main character being Dorothy, you know, this young girl, and having her kind of fight through this unique world of color and change, I think that's good. It's a stark contrast, you know, to World War II, where it was mostly these men being sent off to places like Normandy, you know, to fight for the country. I think it's good to see that it's not just those men who are fighting for the country and fighting for the change. It's everybody, you know. So if Dorothy can, you know, fight this wicked witch, this idea of the wicked witch, you know, and fight and go through this new world, like we all can, you know. And I think that's a good message to get across, you know. And I think it's a good time to start talking about the movie itself, you know.
Right. And I think it starts out as almost, you know, your stereotypical, you kind of got your it girl with Judy Garland, you know, and in this black and white, in this rural Kansas area, and she's in this tornado, and throughout this whole sequence, it's shot, it has the projector shots of her in the tornado, and there's a lot of, you know, almost futuristic elements to this. But really, everything changes when she just opens that door, and it's just color, the most vibrant color that anyone had ever seen to this point, and everything just changes at that point.
And I think that's something to note, is that maybe opening the door of color in this day and age, we might take that for granted, like, oh, every movie's in color. But back then, it's so much more of a big deal than people realize now. And when you put yourself in the perspective,
I think it's really important. Like, maybe we could look into like the symbolism of the film and some of the major factors. Let's look at the main focal point of the film being the Wizard of Oz himself.
Right.
And
You got to look behind the curtain, you know.
And him being
the man behind the curtain, if you will.
Something that
kind of a
lasts to this
fraud,
day. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think.
exactly.
And is that symbolic of the disappointment that the American people perhaps felt in the post-Depression era in the government, and noting that the government wasn't actually there for them and protecting their livelihood, perhaps.
And really weren't as powerful as they thought, you know. I mean, you look
Right.
behind the curtain and there's not as much going on, you know, as
Right.
you hope to believe.
Because you look at the American government, you look at especially the presidency and the executive, and they're propagating themselves to be this kind of fantastical force.
Right.
I mean, you look at
and they truly weren't,
Yeah.
because everything really crumbles when people realize that, you know, not that much is really hinging on everyone's livelihood, even as a powerful Western nation as the U.S. goes.
And they really, at the start of the movie, they shrink it down to a very small scale issue. It's about a girl and her dog, you know? And I think that in black and white, in this small town, you know, I mean, I think it kind of just shows, it shows the scale of the issues, you know, at the time. Like, things just weren't good, you know? Things weren't great, right? Mm-hmm. So I think starting in this, like, this small town with this small issue, like, it opens the door, metaphorically and actually, to this new world that Dorothy goes through, you know? And I think that's a good, like, transition point to where we get to this world, and we kind of figure out the musical aspects of it. What do you guys think about that?
Right. I think the way they use the musical, it's, you know, Broadway at this point in time, you know, theater and Broadway was so popular, and that was really your main source of entertainment, seeing it in real life on the stage, and then you put it on the silver screen with these colors, and you still have that element of Broadway and theater, but it also moves towards the future of cinema and and using these ancient methods that go back to days of Shakespeare and even ancient Greece with theater and stuff, and you move that into this modern medium of cinema. And I think that's really where Wizard of Oz is able to bridge that gap of the past and the present.
I think it's perhaps the first film that really shows us that cinema can be more than just the entertainment value that you see. You go to a movie and you pay 10 cents to watch a
With
film.
those Charlie Chaplin films,
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Versus a movie really being impactful in the way that it can make social and political commentary. And I think that could even transition into a film like the one we watched for the 40s, Casablanca, where we're looking at a film that, yes, it's a romance and it's a wartime
It's much
film,
more than that, though.
but it is much more than that. And I think as we were watching the film, we noted that it is a pro-America and pro-Western film, and there is clear elements, and it's kind of beautiful that it's made during the war, and the incorporation of almost a propagandic element is just kind of seamlessly integrated and intertwined within like the dialogue and the characterization throughout the film. I think we all noted that as we were watching Casablanca.
For sure.
Right. And I just want to rehash, just one more thing on The Wizard of Oz is I think it was a very deliberate choice by the directors when using the colors they did. I think they use a lot of deep greens and yellow, bright yellows and blues, and they are able to use these colors to magnify the impact that this movie had, and to exponentialize what this movie is able to accomplish by their deliberate use of these colors. And then we move to this movie Casablanca, which is completely black and white.
Sure.
But in this movie, you see a lot more of the dialogue and the character development and even the set design, which you don't really see in The Wizard of Oz. They like to use the color, the flashy elements, but I think Casablanca really excels in the subtle elements of what you really like to see in a movie.
As you previously noted, Tommy, I note that the MGM clearly was showing their muscles in the Wizard of Oz, and they were trying to set a new precedent in terms of what it really means to be a film and to be a major film production network and to produce something at this magnitude. I think we can maybe transition into talking about the budgeting for this film, because that's an impactful part of our analysis here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on the topic of flexing muscles, I mean, one of the highest budgets, if not the highest budget of the decade, at $2.77 million, The Wizard of Oz. And initially, they didn't really find much success. They netted about $300,000 more than their initial budget. So in the beginning, it kind of looked like a break-even kind of production. But over time, through media sales, television syndication, and most importantly, the re-releases of it, the movie began to see great profit. And it began to get up to $33 million, which shows that long-term successes don't always correlate with short-term results. And that trend might persist throughout other movies, or it might kind of be more towards the older films like The Wizard of Oz, that kind of have lasting appeal and alternate markets.
And if I may, I feel like a lot of the audience scores kind of reflect this. This is one of the movies, The Wizard of Oz, where both the critics and the average moviegoer kind of agree on this. So for example, the Rotten Tomato score on this movie is a whopping 98%, which is almost unheard of in today's films, where there's so many people looking to be a contrarian. Back then, 98%, that's extremely high. That shows appreciation for the film, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with average people. For example, on Letterboxd, it's a 4 out of 5 for The Wizard of Oz, which is a good score. Means people are appreciating this movie. And on IMDb, 8.1 out of 10. So a lot of people kind of agree with this, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the budgeting and the money it made. I mean, this was a well-received film, pretty much all through the board, and that shows why it's been successful.
And I think the fact that we can watch this movie today and still somewhat relate to the simplicity and also the fantastical elements of it shows the timelessness of the film as well as the story. And it is a simple story at its core.
100%.
It's a story of good versus evil. It's a story of, a simple girl kind of coming from a simple background and really going on this journey and kind of making the most of like her situation. And I think it speaks to the fact that the subject matter of films hasn't really changed all too much over time. And even as we move into the 40s, 10 years or so later, we're seeing a similar idea still being perpetuated by the film industry. And it kind of speaks to what films are trying to do for humanity and what films are trying to do to push ideas and push narratives, especially in the US.
Right. And I think with The Wizard of Oz, it has an almost cookie cutter kind of your predictable, you know what you're getting into when you watch this movie. It's your Kansas girl. She goes to the Wizard of Oz and this journey, and it's all just a dream in the end. And I think where Casablanca really differentiates itself from this is the opacity you kind of see with these characters of their kind of mysterious background in this place Casablanca in a different country, and there's a lot of intricate characters and dynamics that are flowing throughout this movie. And I think that's where this movie is so different, where it's a lot more of a deeper examination of the characters themselves than more of just using cinema as a medium to push technology and your own, in this case, financial benefits with Wizard of Oz. But Casablanca is a bit different in this way.
I think you can also see in Casablanca the development of the modern satire. You see kind of I think there is like a sense of satire that has been prevalent throughout history. When we talk about Shakespearean satire and the usage of Horatian satire throughout history, but then more specifically, let's look at the development of working in some sort of a comedic relief element into films that have a serious undertone, like Casablanca,
right,
where the story is taking place in war-torn Europe.
Well, even so, I mean, in the Wizard of Oz, I mean, the three iconic characters of the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Lion, those are very comedic in a sense. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they're in there, and I think that really that you can see that in Casablanca too. I mean, I found myself laughing at this movie. A movie that was 80 years ago. So I think that was definitely intentional. I think movies weren't meant to just be one genre, meant to just sit straight face through them. So I think that there was a lot of, as we said before, like political elements that I think are satirical. I think they're really making fun of certain. I mean, this was made during World War II, right? So I mean, for example, leaving the plane, we saw some Italians, and that was clearly they were poking fun at the Italians in World War II and how they were kind of. Secondary for sure. Yeah. And you see them kind of for one scene in the movie and they're thrown to the side. That made me laugh. I think there were a lot of moments like that which weren't necessarily, they weren't like you see in today's movie where it's really, it's overt when they're trying to make you laugh. I think there was a lot of more subtle aspects where you could kind of dig into it and find it funny. And I thought that was one of the most surprising parts for me for Casablanca because I wasn't expecting that. So what do you guys think about that?
I think what Casablanca excels at that the Wizard of Oz kind of lacks is that there's a lot of more dynamic relations between the characters, and you kind of want to root for multiple people. Like you see Wizard of Oz where you see Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man in the gang that's going through Oz, and you really you can't help but want them to win.
No one's rooting for the Wicked Witch,
Right. There is a completely one-sided, a cookie-cutter dynamic of good and evil, whereas you see with Casablanca, it's just people, and it's a real-world scenario, and especially it's a contemporary scenario to what was happening in 1942 when this movie came out, and I think you want to root for both sides of Audrey Hepburn's character and Humphrey Bogart, and you can really see the ever-changing dynamics between these real people, and the characters just really feel like real people.
I think where we see that especially is in the political commentary and the various characters. Like, let's look at the etymology, perhaps, of a character such as Captain Renault, who is a Frenchman who has sided with the Germans, and I think that is a very a delicate and a very intricate design and character development, because it's making commentary perhaps on the political situation of the war and how the U.S. is secondary and almost a saving grace for the West, where the other countries have somewhat failed to really defend their nation. And there's a strong sense of French pride, but that's directly contrasted, and there's a juxtaposition between characters like Renault and the other Frenchmen who are in the film who are trying hard. And I think that's a very complex development, like you said, of the dynamic between characters, and even within characters, the complications that we see within how characters interact with one another, but how they also, feel internally about situations that are happening around them. I think something like that is developing in the industry of film to give the audience a more complicated view on how, and everyone might have a favorite character in a movie, right? Like,
and I wouldn't blame anyone. I think that there's plenty of people to root for.
Whereas I feel like if you were to say that your favorite character was the Wicked Witch, I would say,
look at you funny, yeah.
I would say that's crazy.
Right.
So I think there is there's a complication, and there's a beauty to a film like Casablanca that's really challenging this idea of normality in the film industry and normality in storytelling in general.
And I think both of these movies certainly had iconic characters, I was taken about by watching both these films, and just I've been thinking about these characters for more than the film itself. A character like Rick, I feel like that is a iconic character. Someone that I feel like to this day you could name 10 protagonists who are based off this, which I think shows the influence of these movies.
100%.
Even characters like the Tin Man, like the Cowardly Lion. I think all these characters they live on today through the characters you see in other movies, which is part of it,
Right. And I think with The Wizard of Oz compared to Casablanca, when you see these characters in costume and they don't really look like who they really are in The Wizard of Oz, and you look at Casablanca, and it's really just the actors and the actresses just, in their outfits, but you really see their face, and you really see themselves as a person, and you really get to indulge into their acting skills, and as they transcend into this character, they're able to develop this different personality. And I think that's where Casablanca separates itself, where you really get to experience the actor's craft instead of more of a fantastical, whimsical element that you see in The Wizard of Oz.
There's somewhat of like a viscerality to the characters in Casablanca that isn't necessarily present in The Wizard of Oz. Everyone in The Wizard of Oz seems like a movie character. I think that speaks to like how perhaps plays where you watch a play on stage and you know that it's not real, and you understand that like
it's an escape. It's a very different
it's a
intention, than
100%. And I think that The Wizard of Oz is doing something similar, where like it's what you're watching is not real. It's put onto the silver screen, and it's not something that you're supposed to necessarily relate to in a one-to-one way. Whereas in Casablanca, I think that there is somewhat of a humane element to every character that's really dramatized, and it's very visceral, and you see that especially with for example Audrey Hepburn's character, which she plays so well. I think that there's questions about, I know we've talked about infidelity and in marriage, and these complications of love and romance that are really brought to a helm in a movie like this, and that aren't just challenged by the film, but the social conventions or the norms of the time, especially in the 40s, even now.
Yeah.
Infidelity is a tough subject to bring up with people, and especially to sell in a major motion picture can be very difficult. I'm curious to see how that develops, especially in a time when, for sure, feminism wasn't at its peak.
Right.
But I found myself really like feeling for all these characters. It's such a situation that I can't even comprehend. I couldn't blame any of them for the actions they took. I think honestly, all of them were graceful in the way they handled it. I mean, in a time, having your husband stuck in a concentration camp, and then being stuck in the concentration camp, and then having your love be in the middle of that, I can't imagine. So I really found myself really like happy with whatever the result was, because I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. It's just you figure it out. You know, I thought that was one of the most difficult situations I've seen in terms of a love triangle in a movie, really ever. You know, so I thought that was something that I was interested in. I wanted to know how they solved it, and I think they solved it in a way that I agree with.
Right. And I think Casablanca also you're going to see a trend in the next few decades that we're watching as these movies start to enter more towards the taboo and more socially, less politically correct elements, if you will, of society at that point, where Wizard of Oz is very family friendly. Any audience can watch it and enjoy it. But you see Casablanca where it gets into more of this infidelity and these love triangles and this more taboo element that you're going to see in movies like the 50s with Rebel Without a Cause and into Apocalypse Now, and then further beyond that point. So I think this is where you kind of see a large shift in the direction of cinema with a movie like Casablanca that is starting to enter into these even deeper unknown territories, less technologically and more societally.
I think it definitely is contributing to an element of a change in American culture where conservatism isn't as well embraced, and individualism and rebellion, especially among youth, is definitely at the forefront of not only media in terms of film, but let's look at something like, for example, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger is definitely a movie that's praising rebellion and praising going against societal norms. I think that is what sells, honestly. I think people enjoy, at least now, people enjoy watching movies that are somewhat more on the fringe of frivolity and are pushing the bounds of societal norms, and people want to kind of perhaps even embrace some things that are perversions in a way that society doesn't accept them. And I think that there's an idea that movies sell better if they do embrace these things. We look at the deterioration of the FAA's control on censorship in media, for sure, as we develop into the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I mean, something we noted was a lack of vulgar language, you know, and that kind of connects to that. And I'm interested to see how, as the decades go on and we start watching these movies closer and closer to where we are today, when that first like swear is going to drop, you know, because like we're so desensitized to that today. Like it's in everything, you know, with the form of PG-13 instead of just R and G, you know. So I'm really interested to see when that drops and how the overall regular person who watches the movie like kind of takes that, you know, if they like it, like you said, or if they're kind of averted to it. Do you want to talk about the financial aspects of this movie?
Yeah. So something that I wanted to touch on that you said earlier was that it kind of touches multiple genres, which is something that wasn't normal for that decade. And I think that led to higher success for this time. And the budget of this movie was around $1 million, which was about a third of the Wizard of Oz's production budget. And the net of it was about $11 million, which in today's dollars is $215 million, which kind of shows how much success a movie can find without having such a high budget. And I think you kind of look at how strong the script was, how you weren't really pulling towards one side as you were in The Wizard of Oz, how it was heavily leaning towards Dorothy and her posse or whatever you might say. But you kind of, there wasn't a wrong answer, I feel like. There wasn't a good side and a bad side. And yeah, it kind of was touching upon points that were relevant to history at the time. And yeah, I mean, the production, and even it has the appeal nowadays that people still buy the movie, rent the movie, and it's still generating revenue to this day. So it kind of shows that movies can find such high success without having necessarily super high budgets.
And to kind of build off that, like we had before, this is another movie that was loved by critics and fans. I mean, this movie got 99% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is unbelievable, you know.
Right.
8.5 out of 10 on IMDb, and a 4.3 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So across the board, people are loving this movie, right? Which is kind of shows a correlation, as we've seen through these last two movies, between good box office success versus budget, and how that relates to both critics and fans. So right now, the formula is you don't spend a crazy amount of money on a film, or if you do, you make that money up in the box office, and that will lead to both the critics and fans liking the movie. We'll see how this changes decades go by. I mean, obviously these are two of the most influential films of the decades, but it's clear that there's a relationship between them
And I would say something that attributed to this 99% is it was kind of something like niche for the era. Like, it was a niche film, you know, it introduced concepts and, you know, things that a movie touches on that you might not see in this day of age. It was very relevant, and in a sense that kind of made it very unique, which might have been a reason that it caught so much success. Very niche, yes. Ash, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think this movie, as well as The Wizard of Oz, were revolutionary for their time, and I think that's why when we were curating this list of movies, we picked movies that fit the niche of the time. And I think more specifically, the niche of the political and economic climate of the time. So I think as we continue this podcast, I would love if the audience listening in follows us in our analysis of not only how well the films did, but also how these films impacted society in more major ways. So
Thank you.
We
appreciate it. More to come.
We'll catch you in the next one.
We'll be back next week. More to come.
Adios.
See you guys.